Okay, guys, let's. Oh, is it done? Yeah, 1:30. It's done.
Yeah, it's time. We got to get started.
Yeah, we need to get started. Handed that them out. Done already. So the so welcome to the OAUTH working group meeting. I handed out the blue sheets already, so they should be circulating around. Please sign. Tony is kindly doing the meeting minutes. Do we have someone logging into? Tony, you don't know what I'm talking about? Do we have someone who could log into Java and see whether someone is online? Please, just checking. It's harder and harder to find someone to log into Java.
Sorry?
It's harder and harder to find someone to log into Java. So I don't know what to do. Ludwig, can you log into Java to see whether anyone is online and has some questions? Awesome, thank you. Ludwig is doing that. This is the agenda for today. We quickly have a look at the working group documents in terms of status, and Roman sitting next to me will give you also a short update on those. We had a virtual intro meeting not too long ago where we actually ran through those and sort of checked the status, so we are moving things along pretty nicely. Then we have a discussion about the OAuth security topics, which is in working group last call, and you've seen the emails flying around. Aaron will talk about the browser-based apps, BCP. We then have, that was a agenda bashing thing. Aaron also wants to talk about OAuth 2.1. We also then have the transactional OAuth BOF update, which was the BOF happened yesterday. Yeah, or Monday. And then finally, we do the Depop presentation, and then we have more topics to talk about on Thursday. Okay, let's jump over to the documents.
Hi, so again, I'm helping out here since Rafat couldn't make it. We have a bunch of documents with the ISG or past that process. So we have 2 in ISG evaluation. There are some blocking discussed positions that those particular ADs know that they need to resolve. I have kind of spoken with them and they're committed to looking at them. I'm trying to press them to accelerate that review. Likewise, we have several documents already in the RFC editor queue, and so they are making their way through the process required for publication. Any questions on that?
Any idea how the editor's queue is going these days?
There are all sorts of other, there's a whole kind of set of statistics I can provide a point or two if that's of interest. We're in the midst of the big V3 transition, and that has impacted production to some degree.
But okay, we are going to see through 3 documents coming out of that queue sometime soon, so things are good. So besides those sort of agenda changes to what we had initially submitted, is there anything you guys want to bring up in terms of agenda bashing? Okay, then let's go to the first presentation. Thorsten? Where is he?
Hi, Thorsten Lodderstedt, yes.com. I'm going to present about the current status of the security BCP. Hannes just mentioned, there was a call on 4th of November where we talked about how we move that draft forward, since there was a attack being described and mentioned in the OAuth session in Montreal. It's the Pixie Shows and Challenge attack. And the question was whether we want to wait till a solution is being found for that kind of attack, or whether we push the BCP forward and publish it. The sensing in the call was there is a lot of good stuff in the BCP right now, as it is right now, so we should move that forward and subsequently start on a new version of the BCP, which will also incorporate the Pixie Chosen Challenge attack. And that's why the chairs ask, or how to say that, announced working group last call, I would say, on 6th of November. And since that time, a lot of people reviewed the BCP. Thank you very much for that. Most feedback was editorial. Hans and also Mike brought up some topics that were not editorial but normative. We will take a look into that. Thanks for that, Mike. There was also the Alice and Bob collusion attack brought up again that we discussed about, I think, 2 years ago, and decided it's out of scope for the BCP. There's one open issue that Hans raised. I will talk about that in the last slide because I just want to get through, and then we have time to talk about this. Our chairs asked me to come up with a list of people that already use the security BCP, have reviewed the BCP, like the BCP, and adopt the BCP. So this slide contains a list of communities, people, companies I'm aware of that already use the security BCP, just to underpin the importance of that work and to get it out of the door. So to start with, the financial grade API working group at the OpenID Foundation, which does security profiles for security sensitive applications. Right, you're already coming up, Tony. What's wrong?
Tony, just a clarification. When you say using the BCP, is this all of it or parts of it, or I don't know? I just need some clarification.
Really? They like the recommendation, all the recommendations that we give in the BCP.
So they're using every single recommendation in the BCP?
As in the sense they are applicable to their context. We can dig into details if you're interested. I think for the most important parts, which means authorization code, redirect-based stuff, sender constraining, and so on, they are fully aware of our recommendations and like them and adopt them and live up to them. Does that answer your question?
No, but that's okay.
Okay. As I said, that's just a list of people that use the security BCP. I can put you in contact with them if you want to talk about the details. As I said, the financial grade API working group does security profiles for OAuth for security sensitive applications, no longer only for the financial service industry, but also for other areas. And an alignment with the security BCP is ongoing as we are speaking. Then there is one of the initiatives in the open banking space, which is the NextGen PSD2, also known as the Berlin Group. And they recently released a security bulletin that recommends all the financial institutions implementing OAuth as the authorization mode for their API to consider the security BCP, to follow the security BCP. And so also had discussions with concrete service providers and financial institutions in Croatia and Romania that use the security BCP. There's also a project in Norway in the e-health space that use and recommend the security BCP. And I also work with a initiative in the area of electronic signing, and they also recommend in their specification to use and follow and align with the security BCP when implementing and deploying that API.
I've just finished the
Okay,
slide.
yeah. And what you also can observe in, for example, the Twitter space, that, for example, JavaScript libraries are going to adopt our recommendations around using Pixie and Code for SPAs, and also vendors starting to adapt their documentation to follow the recommendations that we give in the security BCP.
Hi, Roman Dinillo. I just wanted to thank you for pulling together that list. It's very often we make drafts that we label BCP, and sometimes it's not clear the basis of what that experience is coming from. So it's really nice to see, see a long list of organizations that's coming from, even if we do have to refine what the precise mapping is from organization to kind of write up. So thank you for pulling this together.
Aaron Parecki from Okta. I'd just like to throw one more into that list, which is Okta, which has updated the server and JS libraries to support auth code and Pixie for single-page apps as well.
Thank you. So if the chairs want, I mean, we can maintain a list. I just wanted to give an example of communities that I directly work with. So I didn't really reach out to community to get a complete list. I think that would be much longer.
Absolutely. I mean, this would be perfect to include in the Shepherd write-up if we can. If we don't have enough
Yeah,
place.
I ask all the organizations and people that I mention here explicitly that they are fine with being used as a testimonial.
Yeah. But it could be like on Aaron's website. That could be pretty powerful. Like if vendors and libraries indicate support for these type of things, I think that would create also some pressure on others who don't support. So I think that could be good.
Sounds reasonable. All right. Based on the review feedback so far, the editors plan to somehow reorganize the BCP to get more early onto the point where people that are interested in just getting the recommendation and following the recommendation can find the recommendations. Meaning, we will move the attacker model one section to the back, and we'll start after the introduction with the recommendation. So people that are just want to follow the recommendation have a direct access to that. And we rephrase the introduction. One have to admit and keep in mind that the document is in the end really old. So we started to work on a document early, I think 2016. And it has some legacy from that time. At that time, it was more a kind of a laundry list of the open topics, security topics that we have, and it then developed into a security BCP. So we will clean that up, clean up the language. And thanks a lot, especially to Hans and Mike for really giving a detailed feedback, even regarding editorial issues. So it will take us some time, but I think we will come up with a much better readable proposal. And we will also try to even make the recommendations more concise. Potentially not as concise as Hans wished, but if there is any text proposal, we are happy to consider that. And there is one outstanding topic that we didn't integrate yet. I think it's already integrated in the latest version on GitHub, which makes Pixie mandatory for the AS. It was being decided, as far as I remember, in Montreal to make that either by way the AS has to implement Pixie and has to announce that either using metadata or any other proprietary deployment-specific way. Brian?
Brian Campbell Ping. I did just want to say I strongly agree with the idea of sort of restructuring the document with the focus you just talked about. And I do hope to do a last call review and get it to you. But in case I don't get to it, something along those same lines I think should be considered is there's some reference to other documents that are expired or just in draft form that are sort of like, see this for more information about the mix-up attack or something. And as part of that restructuring and work on the document, if you could either remove those or significantly downplay those references so it's not possible to mistake them for like normative recommendations if it's just background, I think that would be helpful as part of the overall restructuring. That's one thing that I don't know, worried's too strong of a word, but worried a little bit about in previous readings of it is overemphasis of those sort of stray or dead-end documents.
Yeah, okay, we'll take a look into that.
Thank you.
All right. So, and here is the outstanding issue. Hence, raised the question, I should say again, whether the text regarding implicit should not or must not. And Rob Otto directly supported the proposal to make it a must on the list yesterday. And that's the reason why I thought I bring it up here in the session, so we can use the time to gather a feeling about what the working group thinks about that. And as a supportive measure, I put the text as it can be found in the BCP today onto the slide. A lot of work has been gone into compiling this statement. So if you want to stand up and raise your or explain your opinion, please go ahead.
Yeah, what I would like to get across is, and I'm not sure, I'm not completely familiar with the terminology.
Turn up the microphone.
With the terminology of IETF documents and the exact explanation of those terms, but I would like a security best practice to be about you must do this, right? It should be stronger than just a should. It's a best practice. You can choose to ignore it, but if you follow the best practice, it's a must. That would be my point about this. Right?
So your point is BCP is softer than a standard draft document, so the language must be harder.
Indeed, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Tony Nadlin. I guess I would probably, the implicit flow, I haven't seen a lot of data on, the actual attacks going on and stuff with implicit flow. And I'm not sure where all the data came from that says the implicit flow should be, I'm pretty sure what you're asking for is it be deprecated out of the OAuth specification by saying it should not be used. And I just don't see the data there, right? There are cases where the implicit flow can be made safe for those particular sets of applications. That's why I believe it should be a should and not a must.
I just want to echo what Tony said. I think it's not a blanket statement, and also because the implication is also having an effect on the hybrid flow and OpenID Connect, I think we need to take this very seriously, because it does have far-reaching implications for deployments and products, and because there are ways to secure it, I don't think that we should make it a must.
I recommend you both to read the whole section again. In the end, the decision we made in a working group was based on the fact that we recommend in another section that people should consider to use sender constraint tokens. And there is today no way to issue sender constraint tokens via the implicit grant.
Sure. But this kind of thing has the effect of 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference, someone explaining about OAuth, and they said implicit is deprecated. So I think it muddies the water, and I think that we need to be aware of the consequences of this, especially if we make the wording must not.
So it is my feeling and understanding that implicit was an optimization in the first in its first iteration anyway, right? And I would like to get rid of the optimization because it's less secure, right? And stick with the authorization code flow because you can, and that's the way to secure things, not by fixing the implicit.
So speaking as a individual member of the working group, my point on implicit is it was not an optimization. It was a way at that time to support applications that were unable to do calls to other regions. All right? So this limitation is gone. So the question is, I'm not talking about the security properties of the implicit grant, right? I can come to that later on. And since we're of course now, there is no need to have two different flows for exactly the same use case, which is a browser dance, right? And if we can get OAuth much simpler, we should do so, because there is constant complaining about OAuth is so freaking complex. First point. Second point, the implicit grant is vulnerable to injection attacks. Yes, OIDC hybrid flow is not vulnerable to that, but we are talking about implicit grant here. And even the OpenID Connect hybrid flow has no meaning for creating sender constraint tokens. So from an architectural perspective, we should get the message across that the future is the code plus PXE flow and not implicit.
Aaron Parecki, I just want to echo pretty much everything Torsten said. I was about to say the exact same thing.
Thank you.
The implicit flow, the history was that it was created when there was no alternative. There are now alternatives in browsers. So we don't need it. It was always a hack. Everybody knew it was a hack. We don't need the hack anymore. Let's get rid of it to simplify things. And as far as OIDC is concerned, I don't see any advantage to using that hybrid flow when you can just get both tokens in response to the auth code exchange anyway. So it seems like it's no worse off for OIDC either. So yeah, 100% support. I don't see any reason that it should be part of OAuth anymore. If OIDC wants to add it back because it's secure to do it in OIDC, fine. That's up to OIDC to do, but it shouldn't be part of the core OAuth because it's no longer needed in OAuth.
Tony Hadlin. So it was,
You can flip it up.
yeah. well,
Yeah, that's more convenient.
So, it's there. People have used it. That's why it probably should be a should not, okay, because people have deployed it and are using it and using it safely. And if you just can't say don't use it at all because it was in the specification, okay? And so I can see this a couple years down the line to say must not, but not to turn it off right now. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I understand that.
Agree with what Tony said, but also responding to Aaron's point there that hybrid flow, I mean, I know this isn't an OpenID Connect working group, but in any event, the ID token issued on the front end and the ID token on the back end could have different claims in them, could have different information. So you have to consider that also in this, I think.
Aaron again. I forgot to point out that since the beginning of OAuth and the implicit flow, there have been several instances of companies who've looked at the spec and intentionally decided to not implement the implicit flow because they saw that it was not secure from the beginning. So it's not that everybody just went and built out the whole spec RFC 67549. It was that people saw the implicit flow, said, we're not going to build that because we don't think it's secure. And that is the world we are in today. And to Tony's point, I think that we are now at the point where we are a few years later, and I think it is the time to shut this down because it has been a long time, and I think we're past the point of this being a good idea.
But just a question then, Aaron. I mean, shouldn't there be another RFC that updates 6749 that deprecates it, and then at that point this should be a must not, but until then it should be a should not?
I could see that going both ways, honestly. I think a BCP, because it is a BCP, is like fills that role of it's okay to have these sort of stronger statements because maybe you decide to just not follow it and you're still compliant with 6749. As for whether there is a separate document, I'm about to talk about that in a minute anyway. So I'll address that point later.
Any other opinions?
We have to do a hum. So we have to do a hum on this.
Yeah.
The last famous words.
Tony's dreadful. Dick Hart. A little history on the implicit flow that got added into OAuth because Facebook wanted to have something optimized for being able to show some context in a page where the client really didn't have any identity and they wanted to show some stuff. And so it kind of made a little bit of sense to be able to do something where it was sort of a low level authorization. There wasn't really any other data. I never liked it in the thing to begin with. But I would agree that saying must is kind of challenging when the spec says it's in there. that we would maybe need a new spec.
Okay. I will do a hum on the should versus must aspect, and Roman is going to judge from the middle of the room what the feedback is. So there will be two questions. Namely, the first one is whether the statement here on the slide should say should not, and the second one whether it must not. Okay. So please hum if.
Can I ask a clarifying question about this?
Mhm.
The rest of the sentence explains when it is okay to use it. So how does that factor in with the wording must versus should?
Well, if we say if it's should not, it remains as it is. If it's must not, then I think it ends. The sentence ends before the unless.
Okay.
Right?
That would be,
Unless there's an no, that would unless the issued tokens are sender constrained. No,
I would say if
No,
we
it's
stick with
actually-
should not, we could get rid of the rest of the sentence. If we go with must, the rest of the sentence is very important.
yeah, must not. It would just
even
change
more
to must
important.
not versus should not.
John Bradley, I think that the rest of the explanation is useful, whether it's must not or should not, and a must not unless is.
That's what I
perfectly-
was just
perfectly
saying.
Logical.
Yeah. Okay, so
Can you just restate it from the beginning?
yeah, so my first question is whether we hum if you think the text as it currently is with the should not is acceptable to you. That's the first question. No, don't hum yet. No. And the second question is hum if we should replace the should not with must not. Okay, so first question, hum if you are okay with the text as shown on the screen. Hum if you would like to have the text, the should not be replaced with must not.
So I heard a lot more humming for the keeping it the text as is with the should.
Okay, me too from here. Okay, so we'll, Tony, can you record this in a meeting minutes?
Yeah.
Du hast noch einen Punkt. Okay. Ja, go.
Okay.
Mhm.
It was pre-recorded.
Okay, no hums from the Java. Okay.
You didn't hear anything from the Java, right? All right, there's one last slide. A new OAuth security workshop is coming up in 2020. And I would everybody interested in having really, really substantial discussions about OAuth security to consider to go there. This year we met in Stuttgart. That's the left-hand picture, and you see all those smiling faces. I think everybody really enjoyed the discussions there because those are 2 days fully packed with topics around the topic we love. And on the right-hand side, just give you an impression on the location or the venue for next year, which is Trondheim. And it's really a nice city in Norway. And by the way, the island in the center is most likely the place where we meet for the social event. I'm not kidding. Okay, we did a survey and I voted for the island.
Are we swimming to the island?
We considered that some of the attendees potentially will be forced to swim. It used to be a prison.
Yeah. So you can sell this
people were
nicely.
also being executed in the old times there. Nowadays, it's a really nice place, and yeah. All right, so you see the URL. Please register. Propose topics. I attended all of those workshops, and I really, really enjoyed it every time. So see you in Trondheim.
All right. Hi, I'm Aaron Parecki. Going to talk about OAuth for browser-based apps, which follows on nicely from the previous discussion. This draft has been in the works for, I think, almost a year now. So I want to give some quick summary of this and then talk about some of the recent updates to it. This is primarily, it's a sort of complement to the OAuth for native apps best practices that we currently have. This is for apps running in a browser, so primarily single-page apps or browser-based apps. The sort of summary of it is that browser-based apps must use the auth code and PXE flow, must not return access tokens in the front channel. These are all sort of referenced, these reference out the security BCP in order to do these as well. Must use the state parameter to carry CSRF tokens, and the authorization server must do exact redirect URL matching. These are the sort of main high-level points in here. There's a handful of other things in the doc as well as some descriptions of architectural patterns that talk about different ways you can actually accomplish this. And that goes over things like when there is a pure JavaScript app talking directly to an AS and an RS itself, or whether it's got its own dynamic backend component or running on the same domain as the RS, for example. So recent changes in this draft, there was a lot of text updated to bring this more in line with the security BCP, including things like disallowing the password grant even for first-party applications, which it used to allow. And the previous draft basically said refresh tokens were not acceptable at all. And now this instead references the security BCP and puts requirements on how refresh tokens are able to be secure in a browser-based app. And there was a handful of editorial clarifications as well, thanks to a lot of the feedback that we got from the list. So that is the sort of current state of things. I think this is shaping up nicely. I'm hoping to be able to kick it across the finish line relatively soon. There's a couple of sort of open issues that we still need to discuss, which is some of what I wanted to bring up today and talk through. Starting with this one in particular, and this was actually sort of tied off of a discussion around the security BCP as well, because it's defined in there as well, and that's around the use of the state parameter. So if you are using PXE, then you're already protected from CSRF attacks. The state parameter is another way to protect against CSRF attacks. Right now, the security BCP says that state must be used for that. And however, if you are doing PXE, you don't need it to do that, which means it opens up the possibility of using state for carrying application level logic that maybe doesn't actually have randomized information in it, like, just redirect URI equals blah. So the question here is, do we want to actually require one-time CSRF tokens in the state value, or mention the possibility that it's okay if that state value is static as long as you're doing PXE?
Mike Jones, Microsoft. When we thought about CSR protection for OpenID Connect as OAuth was finishing, we recognized that in the wild, people were using state for all kinds of things. And so we knew that we couldn't depend on it for CSRF protection. That's why I believe John invented the nonce parameter, and why that's how we do it. And so to the extent you're covering this, I would try to do what is also done in the security BCP, which is at least list the nonce parameter as one of the ways to do this. And if you don't have a nonce, and you don't have PXE, then yeah, you could do it. But I wouldn't require it, because there's an awful lot of deployments that it's already covered, even without PXE.
Thorsten Lodderstedt, Mike is right. So PXE and nonce are equivalent. So I think we also mentioned that in the BCP. If not, we should. A PXE and nonce, from my perspective, are equivalent, except Pixie relies on the AS to detect the attack, whereas the nonce relies on the client or relying party to get it right. Which, from my perspective, I lean towards Pixie because I have more trust on the AS to get it right. What I don't understand is what you mean with static state. Because I would assume if an application does not use the state for a CSRF, it somehow conveys parts of the application state in the parameter, which means it shouldn't be static at all.
I've seen people do things like put a return to this URL after finish logging in, after the auth code finishes, after the flow finishes.
Oh, you mean you have seen variants of an open redirector?
Yes.
Okay.
Where it's statically configured in the application, or there's like 5 different values it could be, which is effectively static.
Yeah.
That's the thing where, and I saw some language in the security BCP that was sort of hinting at that as an option as well. And that's where I started to get a little worried.
I hope, a misconception. If you could directly refer me to that text, I will take care of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mike.
So I mean, we had the chat about that on the list, right? About Pixie versus state. So based on the recent analysis by the guys from Stuttgart, Pixie should do fine for code injection and CSRF protection. So it's a single nonce and even a fingerprinted nonce that can be used for both use cases. So I think that's reasonable to go forward. And given that we anyway make Pixie a mandatory to be used with code, that's a perfect package.
I tend to agree. My only concern is that the applications have no way to know whether an AS supports Pixie. And because the flow works even without Pixie, even if Pixie fails, the flow will work if it's not supported.
I understand. I understand. That's really an issue. That's why we decided to make Pixie mandatory. I know that doesn't change the world in the moment we publish. So I don't know how to handle that, but John potentially has an idea.
Well, you probably guessed that my opinion is that you should use both nonce and Pixie, but that's just me.
Sorry, when you say nonce, you mean state?
No, I'm saying
nonce isn't in OAuth.
I know, but
but if someone reading this is going to, if someone does not care about ID tokens and they're reading this and they have no intention of ever getting an ID token, then nonce does not exist. So
you should use, an application can choose to use both. I mean, it doesn't have to be in the OAuth spec to include the nonce parameter. But beside that, you can determine whether or not the server, as long as the server supports discovery, you can tell whether or not it's using Pixie. So it's not like the client has to completely guess. The hard reality is that virtually no one gets it right trying to do CSRF using state. There are libraries that people have given, created, etc., but most people who roll their own get it wrong in any number of ways, which is one of the reasons why we separated it in OpenID Connect, because pretty much everybody was going to be guaranteed to get it wrong because they were using state for other things. And yeah, it just pretty much always broke. So if your question is, should we recommend Pixie or potentially nonce if you're using OpenID Connect as opposed to state, then yes, because state people in general get wrong. So saying people must always use state isn't going to get you very far because they'll just use it wrong.
Mike Jones, this may seem like splitting hairs, but the nonce request parameter is registered in the OAuth IANA parameters registry. Therefore, it is part of OAuth at this point.
Where does it come back? Where it doesn't. If you don't get an ID token, it doesn't come back. Yes, that's what.
Yeah, you have to implement the normative stuff that it does.
Right.
But it is part of the OAuth set of options which you can implement. It just happens to not be defined in an RFC.
But I
It's
understand
defined in other
Aaron's-
places.
Yeah, but I understand Aaron's line of thinking here that
There are valid cases for OAuth without OpenID Connect. And if you're going to do that, this is I want this document to be the list of things
Right, but-
to do.
But this is a BCP, so it is perfectly acceptable to say, if use Pixie is your first choice. If you happen to be doing OpenID Connect and it doesn't support Pixie, then use Nonce. And if you don't have any other choice, then you can try using State. God help you.
Okay, fair. I like that phrasing.
I see a couple of thumbs up and nodding. Yeah.
Travis Spencer, security question though, like what happens when the SPA calls the token endpoint and state wasn't used? Is the authorization server expected to return an error then because it didn't use nonce or state or
State is never sent to the AS
state is never sent to the AS during the authorization?
during the token request.
I mean, I know at the authorization endpoint if state parameter was sent, and later on I can tell in the token endpoint, okay, wait a sec, you didn't use the state parameter, you don't get a token.
Am I completely misremembering how OAuth works? Because there's no
you are.
state parameter in the token request.
No, but what I'm saying is when you make the authorization request, I can see, okay, you didn't include state. Now in your second call to the token endpoint, I'm not going to issue you a token because the first one was made wrong.
Sure. I don't see how that.
Is that a separate issue too?
I feel like that's a separate thing. Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out like what state or nonce or even Pixie is placing a requirement on the second call to the AS, because the AS has to do something in order to do this, not just the client.
So I think we're getting a little in the weeds here.
No,
The
not really,
larger-
because like if you call our token endpoint, we will not issue a public client a token unless they used Pixie. It's placing requirements on the AS. And I'm trying to understand, okay, should I not issue a token now because state wasn't used on the authorized request?
is if you're also using Pixie. Is your question is if you're also using Pixie and there is also no state in the authorized request, should you?
It says here, should state be used for cross-site protection even if Pixie is used? Okay, so if that is a requirement, that's a requirement not only on the client, but on the AS.
In the authorized request, yeah, in the GET.
But also on the token endpoint, I can't issue a token if you didn't make a proper request to the authorized endpoint.
Torsten has something to add.
Oh, actually, Annabelle was.
We
third.
could. I think doesn't matter whether it's a confidential or public client. I think you're making a valid point, whether the S needs to be enforced. I mean, to inform the discussion, the BCP says clients utilizing the authorization grant type must use Pixie, right? So one could interpret that in a way that the AS has to enforce that. That's not the current meaning of the BCP. The meaning of the BCP is, or will be, ASs must support Pixie and clients must use Pixie. But AS must not enforce Pixie. We could add that, but that's not currently the case. And to further inform the discussion, the last sentence of that paragraph says, OpenID Connect clients may use the nonce parameter of the OpenID Connect authentication request as specified in OpenID Connect Core in conjunction with the corresponding ID token claim for the same purpose. So everything is set.
So this BCP can refer to the security BCP, which already has the correct language. Is that essentially what you just said? Okay, so in that case, should I be removing text from this BCP in order to avoid adding confusion because the security BCP already covers it?
Sounds like a reference, but I let Annabelle talk first.
One last point on nonce. It is defined as the value used to associate a client session with an ID token. So usage of nonce in a context where you are not using an ID token would be out of spec with its current definition.
Would be very confusing.
That's why I said if you're using OpenID Connect. So making state mandatory also violates the core OAuth spec because it is an optional parameter. It's not required. So I think trying to make state required for CSRF would be a mistake in a number of different dimensions. I think not making it required and pointing to the security BCP would make for a much shorter conversation.
Say the last word again, or the last sentence. Making
This BCP should not make state required and should point to the security BCP for how to do CSRF. And
Okay.
that's that way we wind up with less potentially conflicting text.
Okay.
That
sounds
sounds good.
Mhm.
Thanks. Two more quick points.
Yeah, so sort of wrap up, the wrap up on
Yep.
the former issue, I think we concluded that we want to replace the text with a reference to the security BCP. Is that?
Yeah. Yes.
Tony, do you have that?
Thank you.
Are you sure?
Okay, so these are two more things that came up on the list recently. The issue around refresh tokens. This is a continual challenge for single page apps where you want a good experience where people are not bounced out of the app in order to get a new token. The question is, should we make specific recommendations on how to do that? It is currently possible to do this a number of ways, one of which is using a hidden iframe like OIDC. You can implement that according to OAuth. It's not really defined anywhere in particular as being explicitly part of OAuth, whereas it is in OIDC. Is there any value to making that more explicit as a thing that's possible to do for browser-based apps in this draft?
Thorsten Norderstedt, I'm not an SPA expert at all, and I would like to know what the specific feature is in OIDC that describes how to use an iframe for refreshing something. I mean, that's done, right? You can do that with implicit or OAuth authorization code grant type. So what does OIDC add to that in terms of spec language? Oh, the prompt parameter. All right. Do you want to?
For the remote participants.
For the remote participants.
We actually have remote participants.
The prompt parameter in OIDC allows it to happen by signaling to the AS to, regardless of the outcome, not interact with the user and return a response back. And that way you can count on the iframe from the SPA perspective, returning you a status one way or the other instead of just getting hung up. And we don't have that in baseline OIDC.
Baseline OAuth.
Yeah.
Thorsten, again, my feeling is that would be a very useful extension to OAuth. We already use that in the OAuth context for a long time.
In OAuth without OIDC?
Yes.
I have a feeling a lot of people do use it without OIDC already.
So because
technically it's not
trying
defined.
to write a prompt spec.
So it's just that technically it's not defined anywhere in OAuth. So is this a place to define it? I don't know.
This is not the place to define it. Travis Spencer here, but the prompt has a lot of different input parameters, and it can be space separated, and there's a lot of things even missing from that. So I think that we need to look at that as a separate specification, and that this should be updated perhaps to normatively reference that.
Okay. Any other comments on that? I think I would tend to agree with that assessment, especially since the BCP shouldn't be adding too much normative language and certainly not terribly functional stuff.
Yeah.
So the outcome of that would be to not make any specific recommendations on how to do this in this BCP, and hopefully somebody will propose an extension to OAuth to add the prompt parameter.
What about you?
Hopefully somebody. Not going to point any fingers. I'm not volunteering myself yet. We'll see. Okay, but I'm happy with that outcome. Last point here. There's a mention in this draft about because you're in a browser and JavaScript environments are less secure by default than things like native apps, it is much more important to have a strong content security policy. That's basically what it says without giving any specific recommendations. There was a suggestion to explicitly say like a couple of things that should be in your content security policy to at least have a first pass of making it more secure, one of which being disabling inline scripts. is that a good idea for this BCP, or should we just point people to OWASP and have them go and figure it out on their own?
Travis Spencer, I don't think we should, because it's not just for single page applications, it's for all flows, browser-based flows for OAuth. The one thing that single page applications could allow is an origin that can frame them, and then that could change the CSP responses. If you look at our assisted token flow specification, we talked about how registration of the origins could be done in the client and how that could update the CSP. But I think that what we need is a more general explanation of how to use CSP and OAuth, and then perhaps profile it, for lack of a better word, for browser-based applications.
Are you volunteering to write that?
As a separate CSP specification, you mean that this one would? Yeah, it's not hard. It's just a little bit, and I can take it from that assisted token flow document, I think. So maybe.
Okay, I think I agree with that as well. It sounds like a space that is probably too large to fit into a paragraph in this doc, and the fact that it applies outside of this as well is a good argument for it being a separate thing somewhere.
I don't know who is going to work on that separate thing. You could do that? Okay. Tony, did you? Yes. Okay. It almost sounds like I annoy you, huh?
Great. Okay. That. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, but should that go in that security best practice one? I mean, should it be a separate section there of how to use CSP in OAuth for doing browser-based flows? Seems like that's the place to put it rather than its whole other document.
Thorsten, do you have an opinion about that as the editor of that document?
From a methodological perspective, is it something that applies to SPAs only? That applies to all kinds of web applications? All web applications. Okay. If you could suggest some text, we can add it. I mean, Daniel Fett is much more knowledgeable about that. I think he will review that. John, what do you think? Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
Okay.
Seems we have a plan.
Cool. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, please suggest text as soon as possible. So because as discussed previously, the document is in working group last call and going to be finished soon. Thorsten will do an update, and so we can reflect that right away.
I'll be sure to do it ASAP.
Thank you. Okay, great. That's it for me on this one then.
So what's so few open issues only, which looks pretty promising. So do we have a timeline to get this updated and news? I assume that those are the only open issues we are aware of. So we could actually start a working group last call fairly soon.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I'll be working on these updates in the next week or so. So I should have something ready.
So we could actually target even a working group last call in December, beginning of December.
I'd be happy to do that. Yep.
Excellent. Okay.
Great.
But wait here.
Yes. Click it again. Yeah. All right, it's me again. So this is something that came up in the last couple of rounds of discussions around transactional auth that Justin has been leading. And this came up on Monday during the session then. A little bit of background on what I want to talk about here. So OAuth, as we all know, started a long time ago with actually around 10 years ago, and has defined several grant types. These are the grant types that were set out at the beginning. Over the course of the last 10 years, this has changed. This space has changed a lot. So we've added Pixie through another RFC, originally only for native apps. There was a native apps BCP that references Pixie and saying, here's how to, don't use implicit on mobile apps anymore. Since then, we've also added the device grant, which is a totally new top-level grant type in OAuth. We've also now got the single-page app, browser-based app BCP that also says to do Pixie. The security BCP is coming along now and is sort of crossing out the implicit flow and password flow, and also saying do Pixie for even confidential clients, which is a new concept there. So this is kind of what I'm trying to make here is this is kind of a lot for people who are new to the space to try to navigate, because essentially you start at the beginning and you have to read all these RFCs, and this is the picture you get, which is that, oh, well, I just learned about this thing and now I'm not supposed to do it. So instead I have to do this other thing. And if you look at what we actually have right now, this is actually what's left, is that basically everything uses auth code and Pixie in a browser and for mobile apps, or it's doing the client credentials grant because it's not a end user application, or it's doing the device grant. And this is basically all we have left from OAuth core. We've crossed out all the other ones through the various, yes?
Thorsten, I'm not splitting hairs, but you should mention the refresh token grant.
Oh, thanks. Yes, refresh token. I didn't put that in here because it can't start the flow. You can't get the first access token that way, but yes. Go ahead.
Mike again, the reason that OAuth core defined IANA registries to extend it was to enable extensions to be written. You can't just look at the RFCs. You actually have to look at all the extensions that are registered in the IANA registry. So for instance, there are—
So you're saying it's even worse than this?
So for instance, there's a set of extensions that define some additional response types. Those are very important in the wild. As John said, use of the JOT assertion flow is incredibly important. And there's some other stuff in the pipe that we saw in the first slide from the chairs. We have token exchange. We have signed requests. So there's a lot more than you said, and you know that.
Yep.
But my main point is it's not just the RFCs that count, it's the stuff in the registry that this working group established for that purpose that counts.
So my point here is just that we have patched and cut out things and added band-aids from the core itself, things defined in the core, not even in registries.
Well, the device flow is actually, strictly speaking, not in the core.
That was one that was added, not in the core. But it has, I feel like we are asking people to learn an awful lot of history that is basically no longer relevant in order to understand what to do. And if we give people, my goal with this would be to give people a new starting point to start here, and then go on from there to read about extensions that are, very important, enabling very useful things. Basically, my goal with defining something that we would call OAuth 2.1 would be to take what we do know is best practice today that is deployed, give it, sort of snapshot that, and have this be a new starting point for people to go launch off of.
Hannes from the floor now. I think it might also be worthwhile to think about like who the audience is, because I think in the meanwhile, after all these years, there are different types of people who want to read into the material, and there are some who are developers of applications who want to use OAuth, and they probably are better off relying on experts like you guys here who develop libraries and to use those libraries properly. And they would then implement some of the stuff we talked about earlier during the meeting. If you are into writing your own server from scratch, I think you have to understand that you have to do more reading. You have to have a better understanding, and there's a certain amount of effort that is unavoidable. So a book like the one you wrote or Justin would probably be a good starting point, and then you have to read the documents anyway. I think that's you have to distinguish between the different audience, or at least it would appear to me that this could be useful.
Justin Richer. I think it should, I agree with Aaron that this is something we should probably do, and considering that two of the authors of books that kind of do this thing for people are saying, hey, this should be a real thing from the working group, that should be taken as a signal to the community. Right. Aaron and I both make a significant portion of our income from explaining to people how to navigate this stuff. And if I have to do that less, I'll be happier. I think this is a good idea. So it's not so much saying don't go read the registry, but it's saying we're not going to force you down that road right at the very beginning. It's just collecting the stuff that's already out there on a page.
Thanks. Yeah.
And that would be better as an RFC.
And I also want to be very explicit about this. This is not meant to be any new behavior in here. This is not meant to define anything new at all. This will be meant to, and it doesn't even have to be an RFC. It's fine if it would be a BCP. Turns out people don't actually know the difference and don't care. Don't even go there. The point is that having some, official piece of paper people starting from is my goal here. Go ahead.
Yeah, Tony Nadland. So it's a little bit confusing that this would be yet another BCP or something like that. Why we've got the current BCP, yes, right? Why can't we roll that up into an OAuth 2.0 document so you don't have to go through all that crap of reading the BCP, and it would take everything that the BCP has and says this is the new base, and just go from there, because that stuff's already been written. You can just take out things that that are in there and take it out and just run with that. And then we don't have a BCP anymore. We just got the new 2.1 document.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not picky on the particular format this takes. I think that's what we want to discuss. I don't have a lot of time left, so before I let you go, I want to just mention a couple other things, and also mention that we have time allocated here at 3 o'clock, where I booked a meeting room, not in this room. It's in another room here, where I would like to actually continue those discussions on how this might actually look, what this might actually look like. But yeah, just quickly, the goal is not to define anything new. The goal is to take what is defined and snapshot that, which is, these are the things, don't comment on these particular points right now, to save this for the discussion. But this is sort of what I see as like, here's things that we know works well. And there's a separate issue here, which I do want to address or bring up, which is that if you're building an authorization server that is meant to be interoperable with arbitrary resource servers, there's, I think, a separate set of things those ASs need to do in order to be interoperable, and we already have a set of specs that address that also. And I think that's also another thing to bring up. So yeah, feel free to cut me off whenever, but whenever the comments are done,
we are good time.
We're good? Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that don't feel like you have to bring up all of the points right now, because we do have time set aside immediately following this meeting, where I would love to actually continue those discussions in a lot more detail.
This is Thorsten. It happens not so often, but I fully agree with Tony. We already have a BCP. We don't need another one. The problem with the BCP is that it is a workaround, right? Because all the recommendations that we are giving right now should, from my perspective, update the RFC 6749 and 50. It should go in the security consideration section, or even in the main body of the text. And I think we should develop a culture of updating OAuth from time to time, because the current spec is, I think, a decade old. Yeah, like TIS does. And I don't know why we were reluctant to come up with new RFCs. We've done that before with our RFC 6749 that replaced the OAuth 1 RFC. we should do that again and carefully think about backward compatibility and what we do with breaking changes and so on. I like the idea. We should be consequent. And from my experience with working with other communities, my assessment is the RFC is not made for the average developer that does want to implement an app, because that most likely will use the documentation provided by the service provider. The RFC is being consumed by people that write libraries or define APIs for ecosystems or applications. And those typically only read the RFC 6749, nothing more. So if we're going to replace that with a new RFC that has all the most stuff in there, what's in the BCP right now, that's perfect from my perspective.
Hi, Roman Donadio, No Hat. So thinking about this more abstractly, not here specifically in OAuth, it seems like we have a bunch of documents that specify all sorts of things. Sometimes it's must, sometimes it's kind of optional. But what we want to do is cherry pick from that collection of documents what we want people to do, typically being more restrictive, saying don't do a bunch of things, or up-leveling kind of security, making instances where it's a should be a must. In other forums, I've heard that called a profile. I've also heard that called an applicability statement. So another thought on how we might pursue this.
That's, I think, not entirely what I'm describing, because I am actually describing sort of, if you play all of the RFCs and BCPs in order, you get something which is what I want to snapshot. And it's not that it's a profile or tightening up or loosening of things. It's just that at some point, this RFC says now do this, and then this one says don't do this thing that was defined there. So I'm not saying, it's not even that it's not optional anymore. Like if you follow the security BCP, which is probably the farthest thing along that references the most things back in the chain, that's the closest to what I'm talking about that we have. So it's not that it's making new tighter decisions about security, it's that it's taking the set of documents that we have and then just removing the stuff that these various pieces say have already been removed from the spec.
Right. And I mean, I won't kind of belabor the point, but I think with a profile, in addition to, saying should a must, which is, I think what you keyed in on, you could do the other thing, which is just to say, you're not doing that, or we're just taking a vertical cut of it. I mean, we'd have to obviously look at it a lot more closely. Yeah. Thanks.
And I think the profile thing is a good point, though, because the requirements on ASs for using things like JOT access tokens and token introspection, I think those do fit as a profile of, if you are building this thing that looks like this, this is how you should be doing it.
I guess I'm not sure if this is a profile or a 2.1 or a BIS or what, but generally speaking, I'm in favor of something along these lines. I agree that I think there's a need there, and some sort of document that's more accessible and covers more things is definitely worthwhile to people. I do think it might be more difficult than you've made it seem to pick and choose which pieces are included or not. Like you pointed to the device grant specifically, like that could go in or out. It's kind of arbitrary. JWT client authentication could be in or out, and certainly they don't all need to be there, but I guess we'll have to think about how that looks.
That's exactly what I want to talk about.
Or if there's
at the next session,
maybe references to things as opposed to fully inline them or so forth. But yeah, in general, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Saw Mike there and reminded me, while it's sort of true about the registry, I did want to say that most people in the world don't even know the registry exists. So the expectation that people would go there and sort of work backwards from it is I don't think very pragmatic in the real world.
Yeah, I agree with that.
As I said at the mic during the sec dispatch discussions, and we can talk about this in the next hour, but we need to consider very carefully if we're going to do things that bifurcate a working ecosystem. I am fine, like Brian, with writing a profile or a document, whatever you call it, that picks and chooses from what we have and doesn't break anything. If we go down the road of changing protocols, that's a much bigger deal, and I'm not necessarily in favor of that. To Torsten's I think, somewhat throwaway comment. Where are you, Torsten? Hi, Torsten. About, well, we should get in the habit of updating OAuth, just like we update TCP. Just like we update TCP. They're actually very different situations. The good news about TCP is there's a very small number of implementations in the world, and they're behind APIs that for the most part don't change when you update TCP. So applications keep working, they just start using a new version of the protocol. Whereas if we update OAuth, there's going to be hundreds or thousands of implementations that have to consider whether to update themselves. And we could build chaos really quickly.
Torsten again. First of all, I refer to TLS, not to TCP. And the TLS is updated regularly.
And I meant TLS.
Okay, all right. So there's 1.0, there's 1.2 and 1.3 and so on. So it's possible. And that's why I said, and it wasn't a throwaway comment, we need to carefully think about breaking changes, when we make them, how we make them, and how we support, for example, ASs to support different versions of the protocol to stay backward compatible. Looking forward, I would like to come up with, or I want to change the way we work so that we really maintain the ecosystem instead of preserving the ecosystem for the next 20 years.
But I do stand by my point that TLS is behind APIs that don't change when you update TLS, where changes to OAuth don't have that property.
I would actually disagree with that point, because it's really only ASs where that breaking change happens. If you're building an application consuming an OAuth API, you get an access token. The AS is supposed to be able to change what the access token looks like already. How that application gets an access token is probably going to be using a library. You update your OAuth library like you update your TLS library. I think they're not as different as you're making out them out to be.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Back to the profile versus protocol version question. To my mind, a profile document would be one which, much like the current BCP that's being developed, references the existing documents and says, hey, this is the stuff that you should use. This stuff you really shouldn't anymore. Whereas a protocol version would be a new document that obsoletes a bunch of RFCs rather than refers to them. And the benefit of that potentially being that developers have one thing that they have to read rather than one thing they read and then a dozen or 24 other things that they read that modify and amend and gradually tweak their understanding of what they're supposed to build, or lack of understanding. I think the protocol versioning idea is appealing. However, in the face of potentially parallel developments on an OAuth 3, that may be a lot to try and get the community to digest. And we may find a lot of friction there with development or adoption or or people becoming confused about what it is exactly we're trying to do. As to what the pain points are for upgrading that, TLS versus OAuth, I think the simplicity of TLS version upgrades is being overstated. Having had some exposure to real world upgrade processes, it's painful, although there's a lot of backwards compatibility issues that you still have to maintain, despite the fact that theoretically clients are just using a library and it all just works. It's harder than it might look.
Hi, Roman Danilio. Sensitive to that, we're running out of time. I just wanted to suggest to the working groups that we've had a lot of discussion. My question would be, independent of what path we would go down, what information do we need to have to help us figure this out, and do we have that information?
Okay. If something to think about and discuss during the meeting, so I won't be, unfortunately, due to conflicts, be able to participate, but I'm expecting that you are going to come up with a summary of what you guys came up with, and looking forward to see whatever we should do in that regard. So it's obviously just the beginning of a discussion and not the end yet, but it's good that you kicked it off. It bubbled up a couple of times and people approached us about this topic before. And it seems that there's broader interest to discuss and to do something about this. So that's
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
Hopefully see you there. Butterworth Room is the one that I booked.
Yeah. Okay. And now we switch over to Thorsten again. And we'll have the first part for the rest of the session of the Depop discussion, and then there will be more at the next session. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, okay. Wrong, sorry.
Do we have slides? Did we get?
Did you guys have sent me slides? Guys, did you send me slides? Do you want to use slides? Sure. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
We are going to do that. We're postponing it to the next session. Can we have the discussion start for the Depop, and then we have another session and then finalize that? Is that good for you guys?
I'd rather do it at once, but I'll try to do what I can.
Okay.
I guess. You didn't get another update of slides, did you? Upload it?
So it was through the tool. It didn't. It said authorize, and I clicked on authorize. So
Does it not take? Well,
is that the right version?
No,
Mm.
but it's close.
It's good enough.
It'll be close. It'll be. Okay. All right. So OAuth 2 demonstration of proof of possession at the application layer, otherwise known as Depop.
Sure.
So sort of quick overview of what we're talking about here. Depop is a draft proposal for a newish, simple and concise approach to a proof of possession for OAuth access and refresh tokens. And the idea is it's using application level constructs and leveraging existing library support to make it happen. So hopefully it's actually implementable and deployable. There have been, as many of you probably know, a lot of efforts around proof of possession in OAuth. I list them out here, and they've all been somewhat unsuccessful to varying degrees, and I'm responsible for some of those, so I don't try to cast aspersions here on anybody. I have as many aspersions on me as the next one, but we've tried a lot of different things with varying levels of success. I think we've learned some things in the process as well, and that brings us to sort of this new effort, which in the motivations behind it are really just to have some, at some level, it's just to provide something that's widely applicable and better than just basic bearer tokens, as well as the fact that the OAuth 2 security BCP that we talked about earlier does recommend the use of sender constraints tokens, although it's sort of aspirational because we don't have a lot of great ways to actually do it. And it recommends this to prevent token replay across from RS to RS, basically at different endpoints. But there's a lot of other benefits of proof of possession style tokens beyond just that. And like I said, we sort of lack a suitable and widely applicable POP method right now. This is especially true for single page applications. We do have the soon to be RFC MTLS draft for OAuth, but it has sort of, to put it mildly, major UX implications when using it in the browser. It's basically unusable except in very, very specialized sort of controlled situations. So it's there, it's going to be an RFC, but it's really not practically usable for spot type applications. And I say here that the status of token binding is uncertain. I think that's putting it somewhat mildly. And so we also have sort of uncovered the desire or the need as of late to have proof of possession bound refresh tokens for public clients as well. Having a stronger guarantee around the refresh tokens issued to public clients is something that's desirable and useful. So we have this proposal for Depop flow, just showing the diagram here. The thing that maybe we've learned or taken from other things is there's some similarity to how token binding worked here, and that we have the same sort of key proof method that's used regardless of where the request is made. So whether the request is made to an authorization server as part of the token request, or requests are made to the resource server or resource, the proof key is sent in the same way in this Depop proof header. So there's some consistency for that around how it's used. When it's sent to the authorization server, it gives the authorization server the opportunity to bind both access and refresh tokens depending on the context to that key. And when it's sent to the resource server, it gives that resource server the opportunity to check and see that there's actually possession of the corresponding private key to the associated bound access token. Real quick look at what this actually looks like. So that Depop proof is a header that's a JWT that's sent in each request, and decoded, it looks a little bit something like this. A few aspects of it are it has it's explicitly typed. We're supporting asymmetric signatures only, and it must be one of the asymmetric algorithms. Inside of the header is the JWK, the public portion of the key pair that the client is asserting ownership of. And then in the claims itself, we have a unique identifier and a JTI claim meant to allow for replay detection and checking.
Brian, shouldn't the JWK, shouldn't that be a CNF claim? The stuff that we defined with the proof possession functionality?
No.
Not because?
So yeah, the syntax, yeah, the semantics are a little different. Although they're fungible. That it's a not an obvious line, but yes, what this is saying basically is here's the JWT, here's the public key, which its signature can be verified with. So this token is signed by the private key corresponding to the public key that's displayed in the JWK header there. You'll see the CNF claim come into the picture in a little bit. So that's in the header. Am I doing real bad on time?
Only 5 minutes.
Ooh, okay. And then the claims that we have the JTI in there. We have a very, very minimal set of information about the HTTP request. So this is not intended to be a generalized HTTP signing scheme. We're trying to sign enough of the HTTP request to make a relatively useful statement about the client actually having made that request, but really doing it in order to prove possession of the key, not protect the integrity of the request. And then we have an issue that time around the freshness of the token, which allows, instead of using expired, we thought it'd make things easier to say this is what was issued and give basically the authorization server some discretion as the time window to which it will be accepted at. Annabelle.
Hi, Annabelle Beckman, Amazon. So the HTTP working group, we're expecting that they will be picking up the task of HTTP message signing based on discussion at the SEC dispatch meeting yesterday. I understand Depop is not intended to be a general message signing solution. Would you consider adopting a message signing solution defined at the HTTP level, instead of the proof that you have laid out here? Obviously, I'm asking you about something that doesn't yet exist, so no commitments. But I guess the question is, are you open to that? Is that something that you would want to look at?
No. Yes. Maybe. I mean, the real answer is this is very much intended not to be that, around expectations of fragility and concern with that. And so the specific goal here was to have a very, very minimal, hopefully more interoperable and subset of the information. So based on that motivation, no, but I'm saying that about an individual draft at this point in time relative to a hypothetical adoption to another. So, but I would like to avoid it.
Okay. As the editor of the draft that's going to be submitted to the working group, I can say that the intention of that design is to allow the application layer, in this case, OAuth, Depop, to define specifically which elements are to be included and are not to be included. So you could, the intention is to allow you to have semantics like this, where you're only including a couple of
sort
of
of profile down the expertise.
exactly.
So that brings me to the other answer, which is maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
My sense was that the specific things that are covered here weren't, that getting to these pieces wasn't actually possible with what's in Cabbage now, but I could be wrong. I've only read through it once. And even with that, we're already having some ongoing discussions about whether these are the right elements or not. So
Yeah.
I guess that brings me back to maybe.
Cabbage is a starting point.
Yeah.
All right. I will probably talk to you more about this offline.
Sure.
John Bradley, Ubico. Given the relative timeframes of the work, I'm not. One would hope that we could finish at least the first round of Depop and get that published before Godot comes and there's a general HTTP signing mechanism. Should there ever be a general HTTP signing mechanism, as one of the authors, I would be entirely open to, having a BIS version of this spec or a next version of the spec that perhaps incorporated that. We'd have to see how that work played out. But this is, as Brian says, not sort of explicitly not attempting to cover all the possible use cases and not attempting to cover all of the things that everybody is going to want some bit of header, other bit of header covered. And yes, in theory, you could extend it. So Justin is
Breathing down your neck.
All right. So could go here. Yeah. So +1 to what Annabelle said, -1 to what John just said, because we are not, I don't think anybody is asking for this specifically, this sort of custom bit to cover more. I think the request is instead to, if there were something more general purpose available that you could configure to be this minimal, then I believe we should use that, which does not exist as a standard today. I get that. But I contend we should use that as opposed to something more, purpose fit to OAuth specifically. And while I am, I hear what John's saying about this could happen in the next revision. We just had a half-hour argument about a minor non-breaking change revision to OAuth. So this group doesn't like revisions. So once we nail something down, it's just gonna live there zombified forever. So I'm not convinced by that.
Thorsten, I also am one of the co-authors of that draft. I would like to just state the objective of that work, and that potentially also answers your question with a why not?
Why
This
not
draft, why not adopting something once it gets available? What's the purpose? What's the objective of that draft? Basically, we decided in the BCP to recommend sender constraining for access tokens to prevent token leakage. We've got the general purpose mechanism. It's TLS based. We know that mechanism today doesn't work for applications living in the browser. So we came up with the idea at the OAuth security workshop in Stuttgart. Well, then let's fill that gap. And that's when we started that work. So this work is primarily intended to fill that gap, to do sender constraining for SPAs, period, full stop. And that's why it's a really minimal solution. And we even discussing, I have seen the postings on the list, to remove the GTI for replay detection, to make it even easier and less stateful, and so on and so on and so on. So if we can achieve that or fulfill that objective using a general purpose specification, why not? We would be crazy not to do so.
Yeah.
But it needs to be in time and need to solve that problem soon.
Guys, we are already over time. We will continue this discussion in the next session, Mike, so hold your thought. Whatever that means.
Can I have 20 seconds?
We already 1 minute over, so as you can see, there's still a lot of there are lots of developments, good developments that we see, and so it's an exciting topic to keep working on, and we'll have another session, so we have more time to discuss, and yeah, looking forward to that. Thank you, Brian. Thank you all, guys, and see you at the next session. And if some of you have time to go to the Butterworth room, if that was correct, then yeah. And Aaron, maybe you can at the next session give us a brief summary.
I'll start tomorrow then.
Yeah, do so.
No, I mean,
it seems as important.
Yep.